Thank you so much for joining me, Clyde. Excuse the pun, but we South Africans feel powerless about the decisions made elsewhere that seem to have all been flawed decisions. Is that fair to say that?
Afternoon, Omar. Nice to be on your show, and thanks very much. You know, we've been in a state of doing nothing about it for about the last 10 years. Now, that's not entirely true. You'll remember that about 10 years ago we started the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program. And there was lots of wind and solar procured, and it was going along nicely, and then it suddenly stalled. I think it stalled in about 2015 or 2016 when the incumbents at Eskom at that stage refused to sign the next round of power purchase agreements. And that was really during this whole period when we were having a to and fro on South Africa getting involved in Russian nuclear. So it's really part of the historical story that we have not done what we should have done because we got caught up in wanting to get involved in nuclear.
That's a very important input, very important input. So was this during Brian Molefe's time as CEO? Because I just recall hearing him say proudly that when he was in charge, we had practically no load shedding. Is that true? Is that accurate?
Well, strangely enough, it is quite accurate, but I don't want to go into the details of why that happened, but just suffice to say that I think they engineered it whereby they placed broken units in planned maintenance and they deferred maintenance on units that should have been going into maintenance. So they were able then to lift the output for a period. But you and I know if you miss a doctor's appointment and you then end up at the specialist, it's kind of too late. So when Molefe and others left, the legacy of them having deferred maintenance in order to give a really good track record during their period has basically come back to bite us.
I was also under the impression maybe we were using a lot of our diesel generation, which is, of course, the most expensive way to keep the lights on. Is that accurate or not?
We do use a lot of diesel generation, but the say diesel maybe supplies as little as 3 or 4% of the total annual usage. So there's occasions when it's used excessively, but generally speaking, it's designed to be only used for a small portion of the time annually. And at the moment, unfortunately, we're using it far more than we should, and we're not using it in a fit-for-purpose fashion. So we should only be using it to meet peak demand, and we should maybe be using it in the early morning when we ramp up from a low usage at night to a much higher usage in the daytime. Almost we sort of accelerate, if you like. And during that acceleration period, the diesel open-cycle gas turbines are useful. At the moment, we're kind of doing that early morning acceleration mainly with the coal fleet. So it's almost as if we're riding the coal fleet on the clutch, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
We push in the clutch at night so that we can accelerate in the early morning to do that. So we're not using them in the way that they were intended to be used, and that's just because we have such a shortage of generation supply.
Now, I know it's not a great exercise, but we always want to make sure that we're blaming the right people for this. Who should we be blaming? There obviously calls when you listen to the radio, people are saying, De Ruyter's not doing a good job as the CEO. Look at the position we're in. We're out of power so often, it must be the new CEO. Where do we look when we say, who takes responsibility for the mess when all of this started in 2007? It's not a new problem.
Right, I think one can apportion a certain amount of blame to various parties, but I prefer to look to future solutions. So if I were to apportion blame, I would apportion that blame on collectively. The Eskom has been to blame over the period. The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy has been to blame for not setting high enough replacement targets in the integrated resources plan. Previous CEOs of Eskom have been to blame for stalling the process that we would have had much more wind and solar on the grid now if that whole process hadn't stalled. So there's lots of finger pointing we can do. I think the thing that's caught everyone out a little bit by surprise is that they thought that you can catch up maintenance on an old coal fleet. And the reality is when you've skipped your maintenance, the problems run deeper. You can't sort of put double sets of brake pads on because you skipped one set of brake pads. And that's what's becoming apparent, is that there is no such thing as catch-up maintenance. You've kind of lost it, and you've now started wearing out parts that were not designed to wear out because you've removed, you didn't replace the wearing parts on time.
Yes.
And we've all done that with brake pads where your discs then get worn. You know what I'm talking
Sure,
about.
absolutely. Clyde, you quite rightly said, let's look to the future. So the President made an announcement the other day and said, you know, the cap has increased in terms of procuring power from independent and private suppliers. But it sounds like that's a little bit of a Band-Aid and it's not going to happen immediately. Am I wrong? Can we get this really quickly this year?
Yeah, look, I think that the biggest problem at the moment is that no one's treating this like the emergency that it actually is. So just once again reflecting a bit on the past.
Why not? I mean, why aren't they doing that? You've just said something very controversial. They're not treating it like the emergency it is. Why not?
I think there's been this notion that we can fix the old coal fleet and get it up and working again. And it's when the coal fleet has been kind of looked at by the specialist physician instead of the GP. He's shaken his head and said, well, I'm afraid it's not going to pan out like you thought it was going to. And so we have been caught short, if you like, with a gap. There is a bright side to this, though. All the stalling that we've done on procuring more wind and solar and storage has allowed time. The passage of time has meant that those technologies are now considerably cheaper than they were 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, we were still effectively paying subsidies for wind and solar. Now it's not even close anymore. We can put in new solar and produce electricity at cheaper than simply the cost of running a coal plant, never mind the cost of capitalizing a new coal plant. So we're in a delicate balance. We are now looking at it and say, well, having stored, we can now do things far more cost effectively than if we'd done them 5 years ago. But on the other hand, we've had load shedding, which has cost the country a lot. And we now have passed the tipping point where the benefits of the reduction in cost of these things needs to be brought to bear as quickly as possible to offset the losses that we've suffered during the load shedding period.
But that's exactly
so we
my
really
question,
need
Clyde.
to treat this as a military exercise now.
Correct.
We need to have, for want of a better word, a Marshall Plan, and we need to start putting new generation onto the grid sort of as quickly as possible at all scales, from rooftop to small scale to utility scale. We need to pull out all of the stops, quite frankly.
Okay, so when you say pull out the stops, when you say as quickly as possible, what are those timelines in engineering terms? Because for us it means tomorrow, but that's not possible, is it?
Yes. In engineering terms, if we started building small-scale solar installations tomorrow, some of those installations can be up and running inside of months. And they can obviously be done in parallel. So you can stick a megawatt on the roof of a shopping centre, but you can do it on the roofs of 50 shopping centres at the same time. So at that scale, we literally can start putting electrons onto the grid within months. At the utility scale, for large-scale solar, we're probably looking more like 1 to 1.5 years. 1.5 years to get something up and running fully. We could compress that time possibly into 1 year if we lifted restrictions for having to use local content, for having to have a whole lot of rules, for going through complicated bidding processes. If Eskom came and said, anyone who's ready, we'll buy your power, your solar power at, let's say, 55 cents a kilowatt hour, tell us how quickly you can do this, and we'll pay you that. And if you can do it in a year, we'll pay you 55 cents. But if you take every month you take beyond a year, we'll knock 1 cent off what we're prepared to pay you. And so you then incentivize people to say, gee, well, if I can do it in 11 months, maybe I'll get 56 cents from Eskom. So there's a number of ways we could incentivize.
Thank you.
But at this stage, we need to go beyond having all of these processes. We need to actually put a number on the table and get electrons onto the grid ASAP.
Clyde Mallison, energy analyst, thank you for your time, and I'm hoping that the CEO of Eskom and the ministry is watching and hopefully taking notes.